Good evening. Today's decision by Federal Caucus to allow uranium mining at Roxby Downs has been condemned by the anti-nuclear movement and from within the Labour Party and trade unions. After 3 hours of debate, the Special Caucus meeting carried by 55 votes to 46 a Cabinet recommendation that the project proceed. At a news conference after the meeting, the Prime Minister, Mr Hawke, raised the possibility that all members of caucus would be bound to support today's decision at next year's Federal Labour Conference. However, a left-wing caucus member, Mr Peter Steedman, said tonight Mr Hawke could not bind caucus members to vote a certain way at federal conferences. Outside Parliament House, the caucus decision was greeted with anger by anti-uranium demonstrators, some of whom have camped outside the building for several weeks. There are growing fears that fighting between opponents and defenders of the PLO leader Mr Yasser Arafat may spill into the streets of Tripoli, Lebanon's second biggest city. The Syrian-backed Palestinian rebels have tightened their noose on Mr Arafat's last stronghold in the country, the Badawi refugee camp on the outskirts of Tripoli, where more than 20,000 people live in shanty conditions. The right-wing Voice of Lebanon radio said the fighting in the past 24 hours had been intense. The shells were crashing into the Badawi camp at the rate of 50 per minute. Up to 200 people are reported to have been killed, including many children. Correspondents say that if the Badawi camp falls, Mr Arafat and his forces might pull back to Tripoli itself, drawing the fighting with them. Loyalist fighters and multiple rocket launchers were seen there yesterday. The Soviet leader, Mr Andropov, was absent today from the group of Politburo members reviewing the traditional Revolution Day parade in Red Square, fueling speculation that he's seriously ill. It was the first time in memory that a Soviet president had failed to attend the November the 7th parade, the high point in the celebrations marking the anniversary of the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. Mr Andropov, who's 69, has not been seen publicly for more than 2 months. He's officially described as having a cold, but Western observers have generally agreed it would take a much more serious complaint to keep a Soviet head of state away from the biggest event on Moscow's calendar. A small group of women in El Salvador's capital, San Salvador, have staged a human rights protest, similar to the ones by mothers of the so-called disappeared in Argentina. The women in San Salvador want American authorities to help find their imprisoned relatives.
It was a low-key affair. About 50 mothers slowly circled the American embassy in San Salvador. They carried placards demanding the release of sons and husbands held in custody by the authorities. Some told reporters their loved ones had disappeared after being arrested many months ago. With the Reagan administration having so much influence in their troubled country, they thought the ambassador could help in some way. Their fears underlined the worrying human rights situation in El Salvador. Every day there are new victims of both right and left extremists. Allegations of torture and murder by government troops and police are rife. Many of these demonstrators blame Reagan's interventionist policies in Central America for the turmoil in their country. Under close watch, they chanted slogans calling for an end to American military backing for the right-wing regime.
The Roban coronial inquiry resumed hearing evidence today following a 2-day adjournment. The inquiry is into the death of 16-year-old John Pat after an incident outside the Victoria Hotel in Roban on September the 28th. During today's hearing, a witness told the coroner that he'd seen John Pat shaping up for a fight outside the hotel. Jeff Perry, who's in Roban for the inquiry, filed this report of today's proceedings.
John Sandy, who is presently serving a sentence in the Roban Regional Prison, told the inquiry that on the day of the incident he'd been drinking with John Pat. Later they had parted company, and the next time he saw Pat was during a disturbance outside the hotel. He said Pat had been bouncing around in the street and shaping up. Later he saw him lying on the ground, and he then claimed an off-duty policeman had run across the road and kicked Pat in the top of the head. He described it as a deliberate kick. However, during questioning by Mr John Quigley, counsel for 5 Roban policemen, Sandy agreed that he hadn't seen the face of the boy lying on the road, and he couldn't say it was Pat, although he maintained that he saw the kick clearly. Sandy said that because the boy lying on the road didn't have a shirt on, he'd assumed it was Pat. Sandy also agreed with Mr Quigley that he didn't hear the kick connect, as he'd said in earlier evidence. Another witness, Geoffrey Lockyer, admitted to the inquiry that he'd kicked a policeman in the mouth. He said he hadn't kicked him too hard because he didn't want to break his foot. Lockyer also claimed that the same policeman had punched him. Jeff Parry from Roban for ABC News.
A 17-year-old British sailor died of exposure early this morning on a road leading to the Albany wharf. Police say the cadet officer from the Royal Fleet auxiliary ship Olvida, which is visiting Albany, was last seen leaving a reception at the Seamen's Mission. The overnight temperature at Albany was 7 degrees. Police say there are no suspicious circumstances surrounding the sailor's death. His name has not been released. A campaign to persuade the federal government to change its foreign aid program was launched in Western Australia today by Community Aid Abroad. Loretta Murphy is talking here to the campaign coordinator, Mrs. Kay Bysouth.
So what sort of reforms do you say are needed then?
There needs to be a reform at the policy level. The Australian government needs to express a very strong political will that they do want aid to benefit the poorest people, that it is not to be influenced by foreign policy and military and commercial concerns. And the Australian government is at the present time doing a review of policy, and we hope they will come out with a firm policy. There needs to be an upgrading of the bureaucracy. The Australian Development Assistance Bureau is an appallingly small bureau with very low morale, who are really not feeling that they can get aid through any longer. That needs to be upgraded. And there needs to be a general commitment and determination to put professional and highly qualified people in the field who are committed to, as I said, finding out what the needs of the people are and reaching those people.
Ms. Kay Bysouth. A Perth doctor researching lactation says the testing of a woman's saliva may soon be the newest form of birth control. Dr. Peter Holland told a seminar in Adelaide today he'd found the composition of breast milk and other glandular secretions changed close to ovulation. A woman who noted these may be able to exercise birth control by determining the safe days for sexual intercourse. This weekend in England saw the running of the 56th London to Brighton rally, now one of the most important events in the world for veteran car owners and enthusiasts.
Before the start from London's Hyde Park, there were a few steamy tantrums and a good deal of grumpy rattling. It proved that just getting to the starting line was a major effort for some of the elderly dames from the motoring past. For many of the drivers, this